Okay, so this is part 2, the multiplier effect. And so why we want to calculate multipliers, we have the spending multiplier effect, we have the tax multiplier, and the balanced budget multiplier. So when we have an initial change in spending, going back to the spending multiplier, in consumption, gross private investment, government spending, or net exports, this causes a larger change in aggregate spending or aggregate demand. So how do we calculate the multiplier? We take the change in aggregate demand and we divide it by the change in spending. So our multiplier is the change in aggregate demand divided by the change in one of the 4 components of aggregate demand. So why is there a spending multiplier effect? We have spending and income flow continuously, which sets off an increase in the economy, kind of like the circular flow model that we talked about earlier in the semester. So the spending multiplier effect. If the government increases defense spending by $1 billion, then defense contractors will hire and pay more workers, which will increase aggregate spending by more than the initial $1 billion change in the economy. So how can we calculate this? You could do lots of calculations by hand, but calculating the spending multiplier is much more simple, and we can do it from the MPC or the MPS. So in order to calculate the multiplier, the spending multiplier, we do 1 divided by 1 minus MPC or 1 divided by MPS. Those are the same. So multipliers are positive when there's an increase in spending and negative when there is a decrease in spending. We can also calculate the tax multiplier to show that when the government increases taxes, the multiplier works in reverse. Why? Because money is now leaving the circular flow model and going to the government and not to businesses or households. The tax multiplier is negative. So you take a negative MPC and divide it by MPS, or 1 minus MPC. If there's a tax cut, then the multiplier is positive because there's now more money in the circular flow. Your disposable income goes up when there's a tax cut. So let's practice. Okay, so we have assume that U.S. citizens spend 90 cents of every extra dollar they earn. So that's your MPC and your MPS right there. The real interest rate decreases, causing a $50 billion increase in gross private investment. So we want to calculate the effect of a $50 billion increase on gross private investment in U.S. aggregate demand. So first we have to calculate the MPC and the MPS. We do the change in consumption divided by the change in disposable income. So it's 0.9 because it's 90 cents of every dollar divided by $1. That gives us 0.9. So the MPS is 1 minus MPC. That gives us 0.1. So we have to figure out which multiplier to use, whether it's positive, negative. And so we go back to the problem, and it mentions an increase in gross private investment, so therefore we're going to use a positive spending multiplier. So we do 1 divided by MPS is 1 divided by 0.1, which gives us 10. And then we calculate the change in aggregate demand. So we take the change in gross private investment, which the problem told us was $50 billion. We multiply it times 10, and that gives us a $500 billion change in aggregate demand. Okay, so let's look at another example. We're going to assume that Germany raises taxes on its citizens by 200 billion euros. Furthermore, we're going to assume that Germans save 25% of the change in their disposable income. So we're going to calculate the effect of the $200 billion change in taxes on the German economy. So we calculate the MPC and the MPS. The MPS is 0.25 because that's given to us in the problem. So then we do, to get the MPC, we take 1 minus MPS, so we get 1 minus 0.25 gives us 0.75, and we determine which multiplier to use for step 2, whether it's positive or negative. So the problem says that we have an increase in taxes, so we're going to use the negative tax multiplier. So we calculate this tax multiplier. It's negative MPC divided by MPS, so it's negative 0.75 divided by 0.25, and that gives us negative 3. So now we're going to calculate the change in aggregate demand. So we have the change in tax, which is 200 billion euro, times the tax multiplier, which is negative 3, and that gives us a negative $600 billion change in aggregate demand, which means our aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. So here's another example. We're going to assume the Japanese spend 4/5 of their disposable income. Furthermore, we assume that the Japanese government increases its spending by 50 trillion yen, and in order to maintain a balanced budget, simultaneously increases taxes by 50 trillion yen. Calculate the effect on the 50 trillion change in government spending and the 50 trillion change in taxes on Japanese aggregate demand. So we have to calculate the MPC and the MPS. 4/5 is 0.8. It's given to us in the problem, so MPS is 1 minus MPC, which is 1 minus 0.8, gives us 0.2. So we have to determine for our second step which multiplier to use and whether it's a positive or negative multiplier. Here's the fun part of this problem. The problem mentions an increase in government spending and an increase in taxes, so we have to use the spending multiplier and a negative tax multiplier in this problem. So for our third step, we're going to calculate the spending multiplier and the tax multiplier. Spending multiplier is positive 1 divided by MPS, which is 1 divided by 0.2. That gives us 5. And the tax multiplier is negative MPC divided by MPS, which is negative 0.8 divided by divided by 0.2. That gives us negative 4. So now we're going to calculate the change in aggregate demand. So we have the change in government spending, which is 50 trillion yen, times the spending multiplier, which is 5, plus the change in taxes, which is 50 trillion yen, times the tax multiplier, which is negative 4. So 50 trillion times 5 is 250 trillion. That's the spending multiplier, which was positive. And then 50 trillion times negative 4 is negative 200 trillion. So we add those together and we get a positive change of 50 trillion yen in aggregate demand. This brings us to the balanced budget multiplier. So this is how you calculate the balanced budget multiplier. So government spending increases are matched with an equal size increase in taxes. The change ends up being equal to the change in government spending. Why? Because you have 1 divided by MPS plus negative MPC divided by MPS, which equals 1 minus MPC divided by MPS, which is MPS divided by MPS, which equals 1. So the balanced budget multiplier is always 1.